Well, it's a new year, and with that comes a new batch of videos. I'm very excited to share all of the projects that I've been working on with everyone. Hopefully, these videos will open some doors for me to grow as a builder. Today, I'm going to use this sheet of 1/4 inch ACX plywood, as well as these 5 2x4s, one of which having a bevel on one side, and these 3 2x2s to build a standard wall panel that has a door that will be suitable for an actor to hide behind in a haunted house attraction. I've already made a video on building a standard wall panel, and that video can be found here. There's a lot of good information in that video, and this is meant to be a companion to that original video. I start by cutting my 2x4s to the following sizes. I cut 2 boards at 93 inches, 2 boards at 78.5 inches, 1 board at 48 inches, 1 board at 45 inches, 2 boards at 12 inches, and 4 boards at 9 inches. 2 of the 9-inch boards are cut from the 2x4 that has the bevel on one side. Next, I lay all of my 2x4s out on a sheet of plywood so that I can treat them with a fire retardant. This way, as I'm spraying the 2x4s, the majority of the overspray will end up on the plywood and not wasted by ending up on the ground. For this step, I'm using Universal Fire Shield's Fire Coat 100. I'm not sponsored by them, it's just what I use to treat wood on my projects. I make sure that I spray every 2x4 on all 4 sides and spray both sides of the plywood. Once it has dried, it'll be ready for paint. Because the fire retardant is kinda pricey and I can only spray so many sheets with a single gallon, I mark both sides of the plywood to indicate that it has been treated. This way, I don't accidentally spray the same sheet of plywood with more than what is required, thus wasting valuable fire retardant. With the fire protection absorbed into the wood and dry, I can start painting everything. I start by painting the plywood on one side with a coat of deep tint primer. Most primer starts as white, and I didn't know until I started building these panels that primer can be tinted. This dark gray is the darkest that I can get it made. Next, I paint on a coat of flat black exterior paint. I paint the plywood fully first, before assembly, for a couple of reasons. First, to protect the wood from moisture that may get between the 2x4s and the plywood because my Halloween event was outside and susceptible to rain. Second, it's easier to paint the flat plywood without the 2x4 frame in the way. With the plywood painted and ready to go, I move on to fully painting all 6 sides of the 2x4s with a dark gray primer. All paints and primers have been treated with an additive from Universal Fire Shield that makes the latex paint an additional fire protective barrier. Before I primer the 2 12-inch boards, I'll first need to cut a channel into the bottom of them. These boards will be on the bottom of the panel on either side of the door. The channel will be 1/4 inch deep and 1.5 inches wide. This way, I can use a piece of flat steel to keep the spacing of the door opening uniform from top to bottom. If that's confusing, it'll make a bit more sense a little later on. To cut the channel, I ran each board through my table saw twice for each increment. I would cut one side, then flip it around and cut the other side. Then I would move the guide and repeat the process for both boards. Here is a side-by-side of each cut to better show the progression of the cuts. With the channels cut into the boards, it's back to finishing up the primer on all of the 2x4s. With the plywood prepped and the 2x4s cut and coated with primer, it's time to start assembling the frame. I start with the 48-inch board, which is actually the board for the top of this panel, and the 2 93-inch boards. Normally, I start by assembling the panel from the bottom up, but for this panel, I actually need to start with the top and work my way down. Since these boards are a little twisty, I'm using a couple extra screws to hold everything securely in place so I can hopefully get the twists out of the boards. When assembling the corners of the frame, I take extra care to make sure that everything is nice and flush. If I take the extra time now to build my panels nicely with exact measurements, it'll save me time and a lot of aggravation during setup to have panels that fit together easily. I made a little goof in this part. This 80 and 81.5 inch measurement is with the bottom 2x4 in place. I have not yet attached the bottom 2x4s, but that's where this measurement comes from. Without the bottom 2x4, the measurement is 78.5 inches, the same as the boards that I had cut previously. With that said, the 45-inch 2x4 is what goes in this spot. Before I permanently attach it to the panel, I do a test fit to make sure that my 4-foot measurement is accurate. It's less than 1/16 of an inch off, which looks good to me. With the test fit done, I can permanently secure it into place. The boards that make the sides of the frame were the ones that had the most twist in them, so it took a few clamps to get everything to line up. Next, I made marks on the 45-inch 2x4 that would place the inside edge of the 78.5-inch boards at 12 inches from the outside edge of the frame. Then I drilled pilot holes on the 12-inch boards to keep them from splitting from the nails and screws. I made sure not to put any holes in the middle because the screws that hold on the flat bar will end up going through that spot. I use nails and screws because the nails provide the strength while the screws hold everything together. Now that I have the bottom boards in place, I can mark both sides at 32 and 64 inches. These measurements are for additional support boards. I used these same measurements to put 2 boards across the middle of my basic wall panels. These panels potentially don't need them, but it makes things look nice and uniform across the back of the panels. Additionally, the boards at the 32-inch measurement are in just the right spot to be used as an effective handhold when moving panels around during setup. Also, these support boards help me take the twist out of the longer 2x4s. That's very useful considering how I need things to line up for these doors to work correctly in this panel. Now that I have the 2x4s for the door frame mostly installed, I mark them at the same 32-inch and 64-inch marks that I made on the other boards. I actually have 2 different types of these 9-inch boards. There are 2 boards with the bevel and 2 that don't have a bevel. The boards without the bevel get installed at the 32-inch mark, while the ones with the bevel get placed at the 64-inch mark with the bevel facing up. I do this on my basic wall panel as a visual indicator for what is up and down, and I'm continuing doing that here for the sake of consistency. This way, I can give my build crew an easy to follow instruction like bevel goes up to make sure that panels don't get assembled upside down. This last board had the biggest twist in it. It took a bit of doing with several clamps, but I eventually got it to fit right. Also, when I'm assembling a frame, I assemble everything so that the side that will eventually be the front of the panel is facing down. I've found that due to gravity, it's easier to make all of the boards line up flush on the side that's facing down. Then, when it's time to attach the plywood, I flip the frame over so that the flush side is facing up. Next, I add a bead of foaming glue to the entire frame. I use expanding glue because it will fill in all of the gaps, and when fully painted, it will hopefully keep moisture from getting between the plywood and the 2x4s. I asked Mrs. Squirreland to come by and help me lift the plywood onto the frame. If I had tried to do so by myself, I probably would have smeared glue all over the plywood. I have her hold up the top end while I line up the plywood on my side and nail it down. Once the bottom has been nailed down, the plywood can be lowered. This way, the frame will be square to the plywood from the bottom up. Thank you for the assist, Mrs. Squirreland. I can finish up from here. Next, I mark the plywood at 1 foot, 32 inches, 4 foot, 64 inches, and 7 foot on either side. This will let me know where the cross braces are, as well as where I will eventually drill the holes for the bolts that will assemble one panel to another. If I didn't mark where the bolt holes will be, I might accidentally put a nail in the same spot and end up ruining another drill bit. As I've been nailing down the plywood to the frame around the perimeter, I've been clamping and adjusting everything as I go so that the frame lines up with the edge of the plywood exactly. This means that I've been using the long clamp to push things in and a smaller clamp with a block of wood to pull the frame out into alignment. With the plywood nailed down to the frame, and before I can cut the shape of the door out, I first have to make the piece of flat bar that goes on the bottom of the panel. This bar will hold the 2 sides of the door frame apart from one another at the correct distance and not allow the panel to pinch in or widen apart. I cut a section at 48 inches long and mark where I want to drill the holes. The marks are made to line up with the middle of the vertical 2x4s. I used a 3/16 inch drill bit to drill the holes for the screws and a countersink that is made to be used on metal. I then clean up the bar with my angle grinder and paint it with this high quality black appliance epoxy spray paint. Next, I use my orbital sander to clean up any glue that foamed out and attach the flat bar onto the bottom of the frame with 4 3-inch screws. Now that the flat bar is holding the frame in place, I can mark out where the door goes on the front of the plywood and carefully cut it out. I set the depth gauge on my saw to 3/8 of an inch. That way, if I misjudged where the frame is, I won't cut into it too deeply. I can use my angle grinder to clean up the glue foam out from the inside of the door frame. Next, I'll clean up and primer where the cut was made in the panel for the door. With the primer fully dry, I'll flip the panel over and paint the 2x4s with the same flat black paint that I used on the plywood. Once that dries, I'll coat everything with 2 coats of black semi-gloss exterior paint. When I first started making panels back in 2008, I initially only used the flat paint on the backs of the panels. This became a problem because when the panels were in storage, the porous flat paint would allow mildew to grow on them. Since we switched to the semi-gloss, the issue with mildew growing while in storage has been greatly reduced. That's the reason why the first coat is flat paint. All of my old panels were made this way, why not make these new ones the same way? With the framed panel finished, it's time to start working on the components for the door itself. To build the door, I'm going to use the 2x2s that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. I cut 2 of them at 76.5 inches, as well as I cut 2 pieces at 23 5/8 inches, and 1 part at 20 9/16 inches. I then took one of the 76.5 inch boards and trimmed one side lengthwise at a 10-degree angle. After the boards were all cut to size, I fire treated each of them just as I did with everything else. With everything fire treated, I move on to fully painting each board with the dark gray primer. Now that all of the 2x2s are fully painted, I can move on to the plywood that I cut out of the panel from earlier. I need to trim it down an extra ½ inch on each side so that it will have enough clearance to work as a door in the panel. Next, I glue and nail the 2x2s to the plywood just like I did with the frame. One big difference here is that the nails that I used were long enough that they would come out the other side of the 2x2s. So I had to be very mindful of where my hands were holding things together when using the nail gun. This is the board that I made with the 10-degree angle along one side. I attach it with the angle slipping towards the back, which will make it slightly more narrow on the back of the door when compared to the front. I can now flip it over and grind down all of the nails that are sticking through on the back of the door. Now that I have the basic structure of the door built, I can move on to building a locking mechanism. It's basically a large sliding gate latch. I made this mock-up on cardboard to figure out how big to make it, as well as figure out where all of my additional components would go. I then cut a piece of 1/4 inch thick flat bar to 16 inches, as well as a couple of ½ inch pieces. I rounded over one end of the flat bar to make it easier to use. I decided to paint it this bright safety yellow so that it will be easy for an actor to see in the dark. If there is an emergency, I don't want to have an actor who is stuck in their cubbyhole because they were having trouble finding the latch to get out. I also chose this big, heavy-duty handle so that it will be easy to use in the high-energy atmosphere of a haunted house. Next, I need to cut a notch into the board on the door that has the 10-degree bevel. This notch will be for the yellow gate latch as well as another steel plate that will hold the latch in its place. Next, I need to cut a board for the other side of the gate latch. I cut a 2x2 to 7 inches and run it through my table saw so that it matches the height of the notch that I made on the first board. I also use my table saw to make a notch in this board that corresponds with the other notch. Then I drill some 7/16 inch holes and install some T-nuts into it. Lastly, I attach that board into position on the back of the door. Next, I need to make the 2 steel plates that will hold the gate latch in its place. I cut 2 pieces of flat bar at 5.5 inches and drill pilot holes in the ends of each of them. I again use the countersink to finish one of them, and the other bar gets holes drilled at 7/16 of an inch. The bar with the countersunk holes gets ground down to match the 10-degree bevel on the board. To paint them, I use the same appliance epoxy as before. With all of the parts for the gate latch finished, I can move on to doing the final paint job on the back of the door. But first, I need to do one last step. I need to use my router to make the mortises in the side of the door. These are the notches in the side of the door where the hinges go. Just like I did on the frame, I touched up all of the primer first, and then I did 1 coat of flat black paint and 2 coats of semi-gloss black paint. I'm just going to go ahead and say this right here. On this particular day, I had my work shirt on inside out, and I never even noticed until I was editing this footage. With all of the main components done, it's time to start on the final assembly. When tightening the bolts and screws, I had to make sure that I didn't over-tighten them. If I did, it might strip out the threads of the wood or loosen the grip of the T-nuts. It was a little stuck at first, but now it works just fine. The last bit of hardware that I need to work on is the hinges. Since the screws that came with the hinges are really short, I'm going to open up the countersinks on them so they can work with my 1 1/4 inch screws. This will allow the bigger screws to sit flush with the hinge, as well as these beefier screws will hopefully keep the door attached to the panel when being used by an energetic actor in my haunted house. To finish up the door portion of this panel, I just need to cut a hole into the frame of the panel for the gate latch to fit into. Around here, I don't consider one of my panels as finished until I drill the holes into the sides of the panel. When measuring for these assembly holes, I always measure from the bottom up and from the back forward. This ensures that they'll always be in the same place and setup will be a breeze. And there it is. You can barely even tell that it has a door in it. Now I have a blank canvas that's ready to be transformed into whatever my imagination can come up with. I actually already have a couple of ideas for future videos on how I would decorate and disguise the door so that no one would know that it's there. I didn't really have too many of these in my haunt event, and the few that I did have, I didn't really hide the door very well. They also unfortunately didn't have the gate latch to keep my actors safe. If you've ever used anything like this in a haunted house as an actor, or been scared by someone using one, I'd love to hear about your experience down in the comments. Don't forget to check out all of my other videos about building and decorating wall panels, and I'll see you all next time. Thanks for watching.